Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Dreams of Africa in Alabama, the slave ship Clotilda and the story of the last Africans brought to America, by Sylviane A. Diouf, narrated by Allyson Johnson. I goes back to Africa every night in my dreams. Osakibi. Introduction. On a January night in 2002, a truck backed up to a statue in front of Union Missionary Baptist Church, north of Mobile, Alabama. One or two people got out, cut through parts of the heavy bronze bust, ripped it from its brick base, and disappeared with their loot. The theft shocked and angered the congregation of Pastor A.J. Crawford Sr. They had just celebrated the New Year and were preparing to commemorate the following month the 130th anniversary of the church. Unlike those of the Virgin Mary or George Washington, this statue was the only one of its kind in the country. The theft struck at the very core of a community that will never have any equivalent in North America. Determined to bring the statue back home, the congregation established a reward fund. In case the bust was not found, the money would be used to cast a new one. The wooden model, carved 50 years earlier, was still in town. The statue dated back to 1959, when a steel shaft was sunk 100 feet into the earth in front of the church to commemorate the 100 years that had passed since the honored man and his companions had set foot on Alabama soil. The bust and the shaft were the symbols of an exceptional tale. In the summer of 1860, less than a year before the outbreak of the Civil War, 110 young men, women, and children were brought to the Alabama River north of Mobile. They had just spent 6 weeks on board the Clotilda, a fast schooner that had brought them from a world away. They were the last recorded group of captive Americans brought to the United States. Acting for Timothy Meaher, one of the most prominent businessmen in Mobile, Captain William Foster had smuggled them in under cover of night. He had to be careful because decades earlier, on January 1, 1808, the country had abolished the international slave trade. Although tens of thousands of Africans had since landed, the slavers could in theory be hanged. After emancipation, the young people tried to get back home, but unable to do so, they eventually bought land and founded their own town. One of their first major enterprises was the construction of a church. Cudjoe Lewis used to ring the bell. 130 years later, it was his bronze bust that was stolen from in front of the brick building that had replaced the white clapboard church erected by the men and women of the Clotilda. Cudjoe did not belong to a distant past. He lived through World War I, Garvey's Back to Africa movement, the Great Migration, and the Great Depression. He died in 1935, the last survivor of the last slave ship. Cudjoe and his companions were part of a tiny group of people born in Africa who witnessed the Civil War, Reconstruction, and the early decades of the 20th century. To these men and women in their 80s and 90s living in the Jim Crow South, the Middle Passage was still a painfully vivid memory. They have been all but forgotten today, but those who arrived on the Clotilda have also been denied. Their very existence was disregarded by President James Buchanan, who assured the country that the last slave ship had landed in 1858. W.E.B. Du Bois did not include their voyage in his celebrated book, The Suppression of the African Slave Trade. Warren S. Howard and Hugh Thomas dismissed it as a hoax in their extensive studies of the transatlantic slave trade. And up to the present day, historians and writers tout the Wanderer as the last slave ship to the United States, even though her trip had ended 18 months earlier than the Clotilda's. If the date of their awful journey has been contested or even refuted, more importantly, these Africans' singular experience has not generated much attention, although they realized more in America than many other groups of immigrants. In the heart of the Deep South, in Plateau and Magazine Point, 3 miles north of Mobile, they created a small town, the first continuously controlled by blacks, the only one run by Africans. And unlike most post-Reconstruction black settlements, theirs has endured and is home to hundreds of their descendants who, in turn, form the only African-American community whose members can all identify their African ancestors. Their story started in West Africa, in the Bight of Benin, a region known ominously as the Slave Coast. From small towns in the countries that are today Benin and Nigeria, Young adults, teenagers, and children were brought to the coast and locked up in a slave pen, a barracoon, in Ouidah. They had names like Kasola, Abache, Abile, Omalabi, Kupoli, Kahunko, and Arzuma. They were farmers, fishermen, and traders. They followed Islam, Vodun, or the Orisha. Some had been married, others were too young to have gone through initiation. The largest group was made up of prisoners of war captured by the Dahomean army during a dawn attack on their town. The rest of their companions were victims of kidnappings or slave raids. They spoke various languages, had lived in different parts of the region, and had different cultures and experiences. But in the barracoon and on the Clotilda, they created a strong, tight-knit community. The man at the origin of their dreadful journey, Timothy Meaher, owned a plantation and, with his brothers James and Burns, a shipyard and several steamers. As some people in the South were agitating for the reopening of the international slave trade, he had bet a large sum that he could bring a ship full of niggers to Mobile and not be caught. His accomplice in the scheme, William Foster, was the builder of the Clotilda. With his schooner disguised as an innocuous cargo ship, Foster sailed to Ouidah in March 1860. There, in a barracoon near the beach, he selected 19-year-old Kasola, who became Cudjo Lewis, Kahunko, a young girl who had been kidnapped, Arzuma, a Muslim woman from the north, and dozens of their companions. Brought to America and enslaved for almost 5 years on plantations and steamboats, the young Africans formed a bloc distinct from everyone else and ready to stand up forcibly to anybody, white or black, they perceived as a threat. Once free again, they regrouped and put their energy into finding a way to go back to their families in Africa. When their plan failed, they decided to do the next best thing: recreate Africa where they were. They shared all they had, saved money, built each other's houses, and solved problems collectively. Despite the hardships, their sense of unity and kinship made their African town a success. Conversing in a common West African language, they ruled their settlement according to their laws. Goompa, a nobleman from Dahomey who had fallen from grace, was their chief, and they appointed 2 young men to be their judges. Within this African enclave, they raised their children, teaching them the languages and values they had learned from their families and brought from the homelands they cherished. Long after their deportation, they still hoped the interviews they gave to curious strangers would somehow get word to their relatives that they were still alive. Their arrival on the Clotilda had been widely reported in the newspapers, and over the course of 65 years, the Africans of Mobile talked to journalists and writers, from obscure people to a Pulitzer Prize winner, and the future novelist Zora Neale Hurston. Harper's Weekly published an interview of Cudjo and his wife Abile in 1887. Henry Romaine, an officer with the 14th U.S. Colored Infantry Regiment, wrote about them, as did Mary McNeill Scott, the famous Mobile poetess and wife of renowned Japanese art expert Ernest Francisco Fenollosa. Samuel Hawkins Marshall Byers, the poet, diplomat, and author who composed the song Sherman's March to the Sea, visited them in 1903 and published a long article in Harper's Monthly. Alabama-born former slave, activist, and educator Booker T. Washington also paid a visit in 1909, and Emma Langdon Roche, a Mobile illustrator, published a book about their story in 1914. In the summer of 1928, Zora Neale Hurston spent 2 months gathering detailed information from Cudjo Lewis for a book. He told her about his youth and capture, the Middle Passage, enslavement, and life in Africantown. Hurston finished the last draft of her manuscript, titled Barracoon, in April 1931. She had produced an invaluable document on the lives of a group of people with a unique experience in American history. She sent it to publishers, but it never found a taker and has still not been published. From what Abache, Cudjo, and the others said to outsiders, and to their own children and grandchildren, from court documents and from photographs, a clear enough picture of their lives, with a few shady spots, has emerged. Very little of the experience of Africans deported to and enslaved in the West has come to light, and it has generally been through the autobiographies or biographies of a handful of successful men such as Olaudah Equiano, Atoba Kugoano, or Venture Smith. Next to nothing is known about the lives and aspirations of ordinary people, particularly of women. But precious information can be found in the Clotilda African's own words, those of the Americans who met them or lived among them, and the words of their descendants. Their story provides an exceptional perspective on the slave trade. For the first time, the same events can be presented from the points of view of the slave captain and the victims, since they all shared their thoughts about what happened in the Barracoon and during the Middle Passage. It also offers insight into the type of cultural survival techniques the young people, ages 5 to 28, devised. Many of them had not gone through or completed initiation, but they still carried on parts of their cultural heritage on the plantations. In addition, their concerns, hopes, and objectives shed light on what other Africans' preoccupations may have been. Most slave narratives and former slaves' interviews revolve around life in servitude, but this story has a larger scope. It is concerned not only with slavery, but also with freedom and life in the 20th century. The Africans in Mobile represent a unique group of people who grew up free, spent the majority of their years of bondage during the Civil War, and soon became free again. Their transition from freedom to servitude and back to freedom highlights the aspects of their cultures that were most useful to them as individuals and as members of a free community. Their experience offers a unique view into what practices Africans retained, those they adapted, and those they adopted. Their life story touches on several important issues in African, African American, and American history, and incorporates much of the larger history of deported Africans and of African Americans in the 19th century. Life in the Barracoons, the Middle Passage, the domestic slave trade, the illegal slave trade, the reopening of the international slave trade, slavery, African social and cultural retentions, conversion to Christianity, Reconstruction, freedmen's politics and education, African American life after emancipation, convict labor, and reparations for ex-slaves. Their often tense relations with some African Americans showcase the complexity of the black community at the time. These early frictions during slavery hint at prejudice, issues of balance of power based on numbers, and perhaps fears of disruption of the negotiated status quo within the native black population. They help explain why the Africans, once free, chose to self-segregate and create their own town, even though several married African Americans. One, James Dennison, uprooted as a child from South Carolina by the domestic slave trade, met them on the day of their arrival and became a significant member of their community. Keeping themselves at a distance from their neighbors, oriented toward their homelands, the young Africans built a future for themselves and their descendants rooted in Alabama soil. Willingly, and sometimes unwillingly, they became an integral part of African American and Southern history. They were forced to work for the Confederacy, put money in the Freedmen's Bank, voted in one decisive election, and were closely familiar with the justice system. Their legacy has endured. Thousands of their descendants now reside all over the country, but know that Africantown, now called Africatown, is their homeplace. Many in the fifth generation still live on the land their ancestors bought and developed, their sturdy houses having replaced the founders' wooden homes. But what has not changed is their sense of being different, and their determination to preserve a peculiar heritage. Beyond statistics on the number of people deported from Africa, which do matter, what matters more is the men, women, and children they represent. The story of those who arrived on the Clotilda is about the lives and experiences in Africa and America of a select group of young people of various cultural backgrounds who found themselves in a dreadful situation and joined together to survive on their own terms. They had the same dream as 12.5 million Africans sent against their will to the Americas, returning home to their families. Like almost all of them, they did not realize it, but they tried to recreate their own Africa on the soil of Alabama. Chapter 1. Mobile and the Slave Trades. At the time of the young Africans' arrival, Mobile, their future home, was Cotton City. And it is cotton that brought them there in a tale of two slave trades, one over land and the other over sea. A tale of migrations, it is the story of white men attracted by fabled economic opportunities, and of black men and women transported against their will. Blacks and whites were two sides of the same story, one group uprooted and exploited so that the other might prosper. And on a particular day in 1859, many fates were sealed on a steamer named Roger B. Tawney going up the Mobile River. Cotton City, the second-largest exporter of white gold in the country after New Orleans, was a place where, according to Hiram Fuller, a Massachusetts journalist who visited it in the 1850s, people live in cotton houses and ride in cotton carriages. They buy cotton, they sell cotton, think cotton, eat cotton, drink cotton, and dream cotton. They marry cotton wives, and unto them are born cotton children. In enumerating the charms of a fair widow, they begin by saying she makes so many bales of cotton. It is the great staple, the sum and substance of Alabama. It has made Mobile and all its citizens. Between 1817, when Alabama became a territory, and 1861, the port would ship more than 13 million bales of cotton, most of which was cultivated, picked, and packed, and loaded by hundreds of thousands of black men and women. Some of the pickers, packers, and loaders worked for Captain Timothy E. Meaher, a wealthy and well-respected planter, lumber mill owner, and shipbuilder. Meaher was not a native son, but a Yankee, the son of a foreigner. His father, James O. Meaher, was born in 1784 in a small town in the county of Kilkenny in southeast Ireland, the son of Tygo Meaher, a rich country gentleman. The American saga of the O'Meaher family started when James, an engineer who had a passion for the sea, was asked to join the English army. He refused, as he put it, to wear a red coat, arguing that no man in his family had ever done so. To avoid being impressed into service, he clandestinely boarded his uncle's ship and migrated to Newfoundland. He remained in Canada for a few years before deciding to try his luck in the United States. After settling in Maine, he started a career as a stonemason, quite a step down from his training as an engineer. In 1809, in the town of Bodenham, the 25-year-old immigrant married 17-year-old Susanna Flanders Millay, the daughter of a migrant from Kilkenny turned American patriot, and his wife Abigail Eastman, whose family was among the first Europeans to settle in Maine. The young couple, who now went by the name Meaher, lived in Boston for a while, but returned to Maine and made their home in Whitefield, Lincoln County, a town founded in the 1770s by people just like them, Irish Catholics. James continued to work as a mason until he lost a leg in an accident while building a Catholic church. He took on farming to continue sustaining his family. During 58 years of marriage, the Meahers had 8 children. The eldest was James Millay, born in 1810. Then came Timothy, born in 1812. He was followed by William, Mary, Patrick Burns, John Cheverus, Dennis Ryan, and Abigail Ann. In 1835, Timothy and James bade farewell to the family and moved to Mobile. To entrepreneurial young men in their 20s, Alabama was an appealing destination. It was still a frontier state where money could be made in a few years, and Mobile was booming. Industry was in full expansion. Gold, coal, and the production of turpentine were growing. Sawmills turned pines into planks that made boats and furniture, and a third of its lumber was profitably exported to Cuba, Mexico, and Europe. With rivers all around to facilitate trade, rivers with exotic names like Black Warrior, Coosa, Tallapoosa, and Cahaba, there were all kinds of ship jobs available, and anyone could start as a deckhand. At the higher end of the maritime professions, boat building and piloting had become the most glamorous and the most prestigious occupations. Alabama boys did not dream of becoming president, but captain or pilot on a riverboat. Timothy was no longer a boy, but he dreamed that dream too. James, on the other hand, was not taken by Mobile, and after a few months he returned to Maine. If the rivers were the pride of the state, cotton was its sustenance. Alabama in the 1830s was living in flush times. Alabama fever had spread throughout the South after the War of 1812 and brought white settlers by the tens of thousands. They entered the Alabama heartland, where they met fierce resistance from the Upper Creeks, who were then defeated during the Creek War of 1813 to 1814. More Indian land was lost as Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Cherokee, even though they had fought alongside the United States against the British, were also forced to relocate westward to Indian Territory after the Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek in 1830. With large numbers of Native Americans pushed out, throngs of settlers left the Carolinas, Tennessee, Georgia, and Virginia, and their overexploited farms, all going into cotton mightily. They quickly drove the price of land to unprecedented heights, and as swiftly the cotton output of the entire nation tripled. Some of the southern newcomers to the Gulf states were rough, uncouth men and women who often lacked education, money, and economic opportunities in the Old South. In Alabama, many could become prosperous like the people they looked up to or envied back home, usually first-generation old money themselves, but could not become. By 1860, several planters were worth $250,000 in land, slaves, and stock, and raked in $10,000 to $15,000 a year, in today's dollars the equivalent of $205,000 to $308,000. Besides the Southerners, Alabama also attracted Northern men and women like Timothy Meaher and foreigners, mostly Irish and Germans. A large part of the Alabamian population had thus arrived there recently, and by 1850, some 45% of the residents had come from another state or from a foreign country. Mobile was the busy, elegant commercial center of the state and its only port. 3 local banks and 16 insurance companies that insured boats, crops, and bond people were doing brisk business. 16 foreign nations that imported Alabama goods had opened consulates in the city, including Switzerland, Norway, Russia, and Belgium. There were foundries, mills, factories, and cotton presses. Cotton had created a rich class of merchants, planters, middlemen, and steamship captains, but even among the wealthy, most Mobilians were far from polished. Amid the large male population, drunkenness that led to violence was an acute problem. Timothy, stocky, raw-boned, rough, with a disdainful mouth, described once as a very Celtic mouth of the Kerry type, was probably a regular visitor to the saloons rather than the salons. When he got to town, the young Yankee must have been in for a major culture shock. Long before he was born, Maine had abolished slavery. He may not even have seen any black person growing up, since there were less than 1,400 in the entire state when he left. But more than 43% of Alabamians, over 255,000, were black. In 1840, Mobile counted 12,672 inhabitants, and 3,069 of them were black and enslaved. The city was also home to the largest community of free people of color in the state, albeit a paltry 541. Meaher did not own anybody. Unskilled, and so like many of the traditional Irish immigrants to the South, rather than the skilled Northern workmen or the German or British nationals, he had signed up in 1835 as a deckhand on a steamboat, the Wanderer. He was ambitious, and he rapidly worked his way up to mate, serving on 9 ships before building a large sawmill on the Chickasaw Bogue north of town in the early 1840s. Soon after, he had his first steamboat, the William Bradstreet, constructed in New Albany, Indiana. As his good fortune grew, Timothy called on his brothers to join him and share in the riches of Alabama river life. William and Dennis Ryan were the first to respond. William, 4 years younger than Timothy, became a steamboat captain, plying the river between Mobile and Montgomery. Dennis, still in his teens, worked as a clerk for his brothers until he died in 1845 at age 18. William did not enjoy Alabama for long either. In 1850, the 34-year-old captain passed away, leaving no family behind. Then Patrick Burns, 28, made the move. He worked with Timothy as a mate before becoming a captain in his own right. Meanwhile, James had been doing well following his relocation to Maine. He owned a large grocery store in Gardner after having taught school for a few years. But perhaps because of William's death, the businessman packed his bags and moved his wife and 3 children to Mobile. John Cheverus followed suit, and he too went to work on the river. But by 1853, at 28, he too was dead. Young sister Abby joined her brothers and lived with Timothy until 1853, when she married a very rich San Francisco banker, John Parrott, in Montgomery. Of the 7 Mehers who had made it their home, only James, Tim, Burns, and Abby had survived the move to Alabama. After having seen 3 of his brothers die, James had also lost his wife, Alice Landers, who had passed away at 28, shortly after moving to Mobile. He had remarried in 1854 to a Maine girl named Sarah. Burns had also settled down and married Helen, a former schoolteacher from Albany, New York. Finally, in 1855, Timothy married Mary C. Waters, a niece of Edward Kavanaugh, a lawyer, Secretary of State, Commissioner, Congressman, Charge d'Affaires in Portugal, and Governor of Maine. With his brothers in business, Timothy, the family pioneer, could greatly expand. Following the William Bradstreet, he had built the Orleans St. John, a steamer named after a young woman he had fallen in love with in his young days. The ship was to meet a tragic end. Among the brothers' other ships was the William G. Jones, Jr., the first steamboat of its kind built in Mobile, a very fast ship that bore the name of a family friend, the district circuit judge. Other Meaher creations were the William R. Hallett, the Roger B. Tawney, the Czar, the last two closely associated with the story of the Africans, the Waverly, the schooner Sarah E. Meaher, named for James's wife and seized in an international incident in 1855, and the Southern Republic, the largest steamer to cruise the Alabama River, which later distinguished itself during the Civil War. James was much involved in the part of the brothers' business that consisted of shipping pine and cypress timber to the West Indies. In later years, he would be named president of the Mobile Trade Company. Burns, who in the early days was a mate under Timothy's supervision, became the captain of the Czar and the proprietor of a plantation in Grove Hill, the seat of Clark County. In 1859, the Advertiser reported that the Messrs. Meaher, at their mill near the city, had sawed 2 million feet of lumber and 1,209,000 shingles during the year, and are preparing to build another large steamer. The three brothers had plantations, sawmills, timberlands, and steamboats. They owned everything they worked with, the timber and the boats. They enslaved men and women who cut the wood, made the planks, built the boats, loaded and unloaded them, and grew the cotton transported on the ships, and the food that fed them all. Like 10% of the white families in the city, the brothers were slaveholders. The city of 30,000 kept a quarter of its population in chains. In the summer of 1860, Burns held 19 people in bondage, 9 adults and 10 children under 15. Only 5 were, in plantocracy terminology, prime hands, men and women in their 20s. Before the addition of the Clotilda Africans, Burns was one of about 2,100 Alabamians who owned between 15 and 20 people. To qualify as a planter, one had to own 20 slaves, and after the Clotilda sailed in, this Meaher indeed became one. His real estate wealth was estimated at $1,850. It was very comfortable, but not much compared to one of his neighbors, Lorenzo James, a planter originally from South Carolina, whose real estate value was $45,000 and whose personal property reached $164,150, mostly invested in his 103 workers. Burns's personal estate, men, women, and children, along with his share in the brothers' shipping and milling business, was worth $19,750. James Meaher had 22 slaves. 18 were men between 16 and 55 years old, and more than 70% of those were prime men. The 4 women he owned were of childbearing age, although at least 2 did not have any children. Specificities about James's wealth are not known, since his net worth was not reported in the 1860 census, but it certainly was larger than his brothers, since he owned more people whose value was higher. What about Timothy? How many people had he enslaved? Strangely enough, there is no documentation on that matter, except one would imagine in his personal papers that his family has strenuously refused to make public. His name is not listed in the slave schedules of 1860 or 1850. Timothy Meaher, the most famous of the brothers, turned out to be the most elusive. In December 1850, he appeared in the federal census in Mobile under the name Meaher as a boatman living with his sister Abby. But a few months earlier, in August, the siblings had also been counted in the main census as residents of Whitefield, along with brothers James, William, Burns, John, and sister Mary. They might have gathered there for a family affair, such as a wedding, baptism, or funeral. Timothy had thus been counted twice in the federal census of 1850, but it would take another 20 years for him to be enumerated again. In October 1850, when the Alabama slave schedules were compiled, he may still have been in Maine, although his brother James was back in Mobile. Whatever the case may be, Timothy's name did not appear as one of the state slave owners in 1850. The same was true in 1860. He should have been paying taxes on his slaves, which would indicate how many he owned, but the Mobile tax records only show 3 people enslaved by the brothers' company, J. M. and T. Meaher, in 1860, and 4 in 1861. Given the fact that Burns and James owned around 20 people each, One can imagine Timothy's holdings before the Clotilda at perhaps the same number. It cannot be excluded that several or most laborers were hired from...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?